Dave Talks Comics, episode 119, PulpFest 2016, part 2. Welcome to Dave Talks Comics, the program where I talk about comic books, cartoons, and comic book conventions. Most episodes are a mix of summary and opinion and include spoilers. Please keep that in mind. Spoilers. All past episodes can be streamed or downloaded from the program's website, davetalkscomics.com. In addition to the program's website, this podcast can also be found on iTunes, Stitcher, and Facebook. On this episode, first a little bit of follow-up on some things I talked about on episode 118. Then I will be talking about the last 2 days of my trip to PulpFest 2016. And finally, some follow-up on some things I talked about on this episode. First, a few clarifications on things that I said about day 2 of PulpFest. First, I bought that issue of Birds of Prey, and I mentioned that it had the wrong credits on the cover, and one of the people it credited was somebody by the last name of Moore. That was Terry Moore, who was the writer of the prior arc of Birds of Prey, issues 47 to 49, which is another arc that I want to read, that I want to pick up, is on my list of things to buy. The other issues of Birds of Prey that I'm interested in are issues 44 to 46, which is the last arc that Chuck Dixon wrote. Then 47 to 49, the Terry Moore written arc, which is drawn by Amanda Connor and inked by Jimmy Palmiotti. And then that's followed by a 6-issue arc, which is written by Gilbert Hernandez, which runs from issues 50 through 55. And that's the extent of the issues that I'm looking for. Gail Simone's run on Birds of Prey starts with issue 56, and I'm not sure exactly how long that ran for, but I believe it was longer than 6 or 10 or 12 issues. I think it was for a few years that she wrote it, possibly several years. I mentioned John Costanza. I've done a little bit of research, and I looked into, because I was interested in finding out a little bit more about him and when he started, that kind of things. He was born in 1943, which means he is now in his early to mid 70s as I record this. When I looked him up on Comic Book DB, it claimed that his first work was penciling a story in Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen, number 112, which I happen to have that issue. And I pulled that issue out of the long box and I looked at it, but there's no credits in there. So I went to the Grand Comic Database, comics.org, which I think has more reliable information than but it's not always as easy to search. But it does have some much better search features than Comic Book DB. And it wasn't John Costanza who drew that story, it was Pete Costanza, which doesn't surprise me because I knew that Pete Costanza had drawn a number of stories for Jimmy Olsen, the Jimmy Olsen comic book. And just from looking at Comic Book DB, I couldn't tell when he started lettering, but it looked like his most recent work was some work for Looney Tunes in April of this year. And considering that he's in his 70s, it's not that surprising that he would be kind of semi-retired, which is the way it looks from what I'm seeing. So, based on the research that I did on using comics.org, the Grand Comics database, it looks like the first thing he drew, penciled for comic books, was a one-page feature in the back of Star Spangled War Stories number 142. And that was the December of 68, January of 69 1968, 1969 issue. And that's about, it looks like, 1969 is when it looks like his lettering career really picks up. And he did do some penciling over the years, but considerably less penciling than lettering. His most recent penciling work that I could find on comic book, in the Grand Comics database, said Looney Tunes number 211, April of 2013. So I'm not sure what it is. There is a reference to him doing a lettering and issue, a story in Falling in Love number 69. But there's a question mark next to it. And that's from 1964, 5 years before most of his work seems to begin. So I doubt that that's him, although there's a possibility that he did an issue there, and then he went off and did some, worked in some other field, and then came back to comics 5 years later. I'm not sure. But it looks like his lettering career took off in 1969, where his work in some romance comic books, in war comic books, in superhero comic books, including a Legion of Superheroes story in an issue of Adventure Comics. And he was very busy from that point going forward. And like I said, I believe he's still working, although on an infrequent basis at this point. Argosy magazine, Argosy, the pulp magazine, it first appeared in 1882. And the last issue was in November of 1978, so that is no longer being published, although since November of 1978, it has been revived a few times, the most recent of which was a digital-only magazine, but the references I found to it had a website. When I clicked on the website, it doesn't look like the website's there anymore, so I'm thinking and I think that made reference to it being reactivated in 2 years ago, in 2014, so... I believe it's gone once again, but who knows? There may be another Argosy magazine that will appear again at some point in the future. And then finally, I mentioned the name David Saunders. He is the artist who did the presentation on the artists of Argosy, and his father was Norman Saunders, who did a lot of cover work for pulp magazines. And he also did a little bit of work for comic books, but there wasn't anything real notable. He died in 1989, and if you want, you can look him up. You can Google him. He does have a Wikipedia entry, and there's pictures of him and pictures of some of his artwork. Day 3 of PulpFest began with breakfast at Staff's, which was a coffee shop down the street from where I was staying. Had an egg sandwich on a poppy seed bagel, I think egg and bacon. It was pretty good. And I think I had some hot tea with that, and it was a good meal. I sat there, I played with my cell phone. I think I was checking on something, maybe just checking in using the Yelp app or something along those lines. But after I got back to the apartment, I sat down and I did my recordings on day 1 and day 2 of PulpFest. I'd taken a number of notes from those days. I'd made notes throughout the day of what I was doing and what I was up to. And so I kind of went through those, and I embellished a little bit, and well, you've already heard what I recorded at this point, presumably. So then I wasn't all that hungry, I didn't eat breakfast that late, but I don't know, I'd eaten a lot the day before, and I wasn't that hungry, so I got downtown somewhere around 12:30, I think. Let me see, looking at my log here. Yeah, I got downtown around noon, 12:30, parking the car about then. Oh yeah, the day before I had paid for the parking because it was one of those machines, and I tried to pay with my credit card, and there was some problem where it couldn't accept the credit card. And so I ended up putting a $20 bill into the machine, and it was $10. And it gave me back $10 in $1 coins. I'm not sure if those are silver dollars technically, but $1 coins. So I had 10 $1 coins. And I'm not crazy about $1 coins. So the next day, when I got to the parking garage, I had to prepay for some reason. On Friday, I was able to pay when I left the garage, but on Saturday they wanted us to pay going into the garage. Exact same garage. So I paid with, I dug out those 10 $1 coins and I paid with those. So I got rid of the 10 $1 coins. I don't think I even walked over to the North Market. I think I just went ahead and walked up to PulpFest, up to the Hyatt Regency. And I went in and I browsed a little bit. One of the things that I had wanted to look at, I wanted to go back to, was the Sanctum Books table. They had a number of pulp, very nice looking pulp collections, including the Shadow and Doc Savage, as well as a bunch of others. I talked a little bit with the guy who was running the table, who at the time I didn't realize who he was. I mean, obviously I knew he was in charge of Sanctum Books, or at least in charge of the table for Sanctum Books, but if his name was Anthony Toll, and he's also a colorist he's done a lot of color work for comic books, especially for DC Comics in the 70s and 80s. And I was familiar with his name. I've read a number of comic books that he's colored. I've seen his posts on Facebook from time to time in the back issue group threads. But we talked a little bit about the books. I wasn't really sure what I was looking for. I had a couple from a previous episode, from an episode of PulpFest that I listened to a while back. They did an episode on the Shadow, and I should probably look that up and put that in at the end of this episode, in part of the notes at the end. There was an episode where they talked about the Shadow, and they named a number of books that they liked of the Shadow, of their favorite Shadow novels. And as I understand it, there's something like over 200 of them, or I believe that's correct, over 200 Shadow novels. And at some point during the weekend, somebody had said exactly how many they were. It probably came up when I was at the Sanctum Books table. They're close. I think he said he has about 3 or 4 more years worth of books, because what Sanctum Books is doing is they're reprinting all of the Shadow novels, as well as the Doc Savage novels and a bunch of other series that didn't have quite as many novels. I believe he's done with the Doc Savage novels, and there's over 70 books, collections. Now, each of these books have 2 novels in them. And it's not just 2 novels. They're very beautifully reproduced. They have not edited them, as I understand. They are exactly the way they were. The text is exactly the way it was originally produced. But the other thing that they include are all of the illustrations from the original magazines, from the pulp magazines, as well as some what you would probably think of in comic book terms as back matter. They have some extras in here talking about articles by people who have either written these books or are experts on these books. And I have not read, and sometimes they even have comic strips on these characters. But all of these books have these extras in them. They reproduce these beautiful covers from the magazines where these stories originally appeared. And I decided to buy 2 of them. One of them was, I bought one Doc Savage and one Shadow book. The Shadow book was the 74th one, the 70th one, which included The Man from Scotland Yard and Zemba. And Zemba is the one that I had heard about on Pulp Crazy. I'd written down a few titles. Another one was called The Golden Master, and they did have that there, but I decided to go with the one on the Zemba book, the book which has Zemba, and the other story from it is called The Man from Scotland Yard. And actually, The Man from Scotland Yard also appears in Zemba. He's a law enforcement officer, because, of course, the Shadow is not a law enforcement officer. He is probably a vigilante would be the best way to describe him. And then the Doc Savage book that I bought was the 74th Doc Savage book, and the 2 stories that included were The Motion Menace and Fire and Ice. And the reason why I picked up The Motion Menace is because it's a story which also features Pat Savage, which is Doc Savage's cousin. And I have not read any Shadow books before, but I did read maybe 2 or 3 Doc Savage books from back like in the 1980s. They had reprinted them. I think these reprints were from the 1970s. And at the comic book store, which was also a used bookstore that I used to go to back then, which is still around, although they've gotten rid of the used books, and it's just a comic book store. It's called Barbarian. I think it's called Barbarian Comics now. Back then it was Barbarian Books in Wheaton, Maryland. That's where I bought a lot of probably all of the Edgar Rice Burroughs novels that I bought back then, and I also bought some Doc Savage books. I think there were some from very early in the run. But I really like the cover to this one. It's a picture of, I assume, Doc Savage falling, wearing a parachute that he has yet to open up, but he's falling through the sky, and it was that, and the fact, the description of it a little bit, and the fact it includes Pat or Patricia Savage are confronted by the motion menace, an invisible threat that renders modern weaponry obsolete, which sounds kind of ridiculous in a way, but still, I wanted to pick up something Doc Savage, and this seemed like the most appealing one to me. So I was probably at the Sanctum Books table for, 10 or 15 minutes looking through the books before I finally settled on these. They do have a website. You can order books from their website. Let me see. Let me click back to the website. It's shadowsanctum.com. Or if you probably just Google Shadow Sanctum, you'll find it, or Shadow Sanctum Tollin, or Shadow Tollin, Tollin. That's Anthony Tollin, who is the publisher, I guess, and the owner of the company that's reproducing these, although he has licensed the rights from, I believe it's Condé Nast, that still owns the rights to The Shadow and maybe Doc Savage. I'm not sure if that's the case with Doc Savage. But there are a number of other series that they also publish, like The Spider, Nick Carter, The Avenger, Cap Fury, The Whisperer, The Phantom Detective, and these are the ones that I'm seeing on their website. So that was from about 1 to 2, I believe, or just a little before 2. I was in the dealer's room, and that's when I bought these. Oh, and the cover price for these is $15 a piece. They are beautifully done. They are paperbacks. They're kind of like a trade paperback, if you think about comic books. But except for their text, with some pictures, with some illustrations. And as I said, these are the original illustrations from the pulps that have been reproduced. And the cover prices, they're $15 each. He was selling them at a slight discount, so I got them for $13 a piece. And you can order them through his website. It's a little primitive, but I think basically what you have to do is you have to send him an email and tell him which ones you want to buy, and then I think you can pay via maybe check or certainly PayPal, I believe he takes. So after browsing around a little more and not buying anything, not really talking to anybody else, I decided to go to the room where the programming was, because unlike Friday when most of the programming was in the evening, on Saturday they had the programming during the day starting at 1 o'clock. I missed the programming at 1, which was the readings from new fictioneers. So these are people who have recently published things that are in the spirit of the old pulps. But I walked in like just as it was ending. And then at 2 o'clock, there was a panel called The Amazing World of New Pulp. Now, this was hosted by Ron Fortier, and it included 4 authors. And Ron Fortier runs his website is called Airship 27. And I thought it was a publisher, but I'm not sure if it is a publisher. But he's been a writer, and he's been an editor. And he describes himself in the panel, and I did tape this panel, and I will be releasing that, even though it's not really comic book related. But he had 4 authors with him, and they talked about new pulp. They talked about what makes something pulp, because of course pulp magazines don't really exist as pulp magazines, because pulp, the word pulp in pulp magazines describes the kind of paper that was used, but it's also come to mean a certain sort of story. So they talked a little bit about that, about what makes a story pulp. They talked about working on licensed properties. They talked about collaborating, because one of the things that Airship 27 has done has gotten authors to come together and write stories to create anthologies. So they get a bunch of people to write stories on a particular subject or about a particular character. And in this case, Ron talked about, and I believe most, if not all, of the people in this panel had contributed to this, although I haven't actually looked up this book yet. But they have done at least one collection of these stories on, I think it's the New Voyages of Sinbad. And it's not just Sinbad, but there's a team of other adventurers from around the world, so it's a very multicultural sort of team. And that sounded interesting. I might check that out at some point, although I've already have these Doc Savage and Shadow books to read at the moment. But if you go to Airship 27, and that's Airship number 27, not 27 spelled out, but 27.com, you'll see he has a post there about his experiences at PulpFest. It includes a picture from the panel. And actually, I would have been in this picture, but I was like just off to the left, because I was sitting in the second row during this panel, right behind basically the guy in the yellow shirt. If you take a look at but you can't see me at all. Not even, I don't think, you can't even see part of my shoulder or anything like that. But you can see the people who were on the panel. Let's see, they were Jeff Venture Fournier, Barbara Duran, Wynne Scott Eckert, who was also at the panel the night before, and Andy Fix. And as I said, I think I already said what they talked about. So that was the panel from 2 to 3, although I think they started a little early, so my recording actually might be a little over an hour, maybe an hour and 5 minutes, something like that. The second panel of the afternoon, or the third panel actually of the afternoon, the second one that I went to was the Inner Sanctum Books panel. So this was this included Anthony Tolan, and it was also the other person on the panel, the moderator or the interviewer, because it was kind of a one-on-one interview, and I think they took a couple questions at the end, was Tony Isabella, another person from the world of comic books. And they talked about Anthony Tolan's career in comic books a little bit, the early days of that from the 70s, getting started there. And then they also talked about Sanctum Books and how Sanctum Books got started and his interest in the Shadow and in some of these other pulp characters and how he got that off the ground, how he got it started and his ideas behind it. And like I said, I've recorded this, so if you want to hear that will be released at some point, hopefully in the not too distant future. After the Inner Sanctum Books panel, I went to, the official title of that was the 10 Years in the Shadow Sanctum Books. That was the name of the panel. And, they did an interesting thing. I can't remember if I mentioned this in my previous recording, but they printed the schedule. Everybody who had pre-registered, well, I think everybody who registered, whether they pre-registered or not, like I did, got a tag, a lanyard with a card on it, which says PulpFest 2016 on the front, and then on the back they had the PulpFest schedule. Now, they had considerably less programming than, say, the Baltimore Comic Con or Heroes Con, which I like to go to each year. So they could actually fit all of the programming on one card, and it's I don't know, 6x3 or 6x2 or something like that, the size of this card. But I thought that was a very good idea. So after the Inner Sanctum, the 10 Years in the Shadow Sanctum panel, I went back to the dealer's room for a little bit. I think I browsed around a little more. They were closing it down at 4:45, I believe. And after, I don't know, somewhere around 4:30 or so, I took off and I went to get a bite to eat. I dropped my bag off once again at my car and then kept on going down High Street, I believe it is, I was probably a good half mile or more from the Hyatt Regency where I wound up at a restaurant called The Levee, which seems to have like a Cajun sort of flavor to it. It's not a very big place. It's fairly small, but they had beer and they had Cajun style food, and I had red beans and rice, which I think also had sausage in it, and it was a big bowl of that, and I got a beer and amber ale, and that's what I had for dinner. And I was much hungrier for dinner, of course, because I had skipped lunch. So unlike the night before, I was actually ready for dinner. And after I ate, I walked back up to my car. Then I sat in the car for a little while because there wasn't anything going on at PulpFest at that point. The programming wasn't going to begin until 7 o'clock, and it was probably 6 o'clock when I got back to my car. And there wasn't any programming, and the dealer's room was closed. So I just hung out there. Although now that I think about it, there was another thing going on at PulpFest which I completely missed out on. I forgot about, and I didn't look in on it. And I probably could have looked in on it at that point. That is, there was a gaming room. So I didn't, but I didn't go up there at that point. Instead, I sat in my car, and I don't think I listened to anything. I think I'd left my tablet, which is what I had most of my podcasts that I was going to listen to on back at the apartment. So I didn't have that to listen to. So I just sat there. I think I read a little bit, and then eventually I got out of the car and headed back to the convention center in time for the evening programming. The evening programming, first thing they did was they had a business meeting at 7 o'clock. There was some discussion about where they were going to hold PulpFest next year in 2017, because apparently they're having trouble with the Hyatt Regency. And apparently the convention has moved around a little bit over the years, although I don't think this is the first year they've had it at the Hyatt Regency. So they were asking for suggestions about where they should hold it. And this is not a huge organization, the people that run PulpFest. There was probably no more than at most 150 people in the room, maybe 200, I don't know. But it was not a huge group. I sat very close in, just as I did earlier in the day when I'd been there for the two panels. This was in the same room. But they felt like they're getting overcharged for what they're getting, and it just wasn't worth their while. They weren't sure where to move it to next. They were talking about moving it to another city, possibly. But so they were casting about for suggestions. The only reason why I made it to PulpFest this year, and I probably mentioned this before, is because it was on a different weekend. The last 2 years, it happened on the exact same weekend as a family reunion that I wanted to go to, and so I went to the family reunion and was unable to go to PulpFest. And I think they were talking about moving it back to August next year, so there's a decent chance, there's at least a 50-50 chance probably that it's going to be on the same weekend as this family reunion that I like to go to on an annual basis. And so I may not be going next year. I'm really not sure. But the business meeting lasted about a half hour or so. There was various suggestions thrown out, from people in the audience and people. There was a number of people up at the front of the room. I guess those are the members of the committee that organizes PulpFest. And there was a number of ideas thrown out, a bit of back and forth, but nothing was really settled. And I think the people who organized it were understandably a little tired. They had, from organizing, bringing everything together. So in some ways, it probably wasn't the best time to have this meeting. But so that was the business meeting. After that, they had a talk from the guest of honor. Well, no, wait. Before they did that, they had the Muncie Award presentation. This is an award that they give out to somebody who, let me see. There was something on the Airship 27. The Muncie Award's the person who's done exemplary work in promoting pulp fandom. And the person who won it this year was Laurie Powers, who was the same woman who did the presentation the night before on a century of the specialty pulp love story magazine and the romance pulp phenomenon, the one that I left towards the end of. But she won the award, and so there was a plaque which has a very nice painting on it that they gave to her, which looks like it is a reproduction of a painting of the Shadow. I don't know if that might be an original in the sense that it was a painting that somebody created, not just a print of a painting. But you can see pictures of that at airship27.com. After that presentation, then they had the guest of honor, whose name was Ted White, and he was the editor emeritus of Amazing Stories, and he spoke for about an hour about both being an editor of Amazing Stories and also how he came up and things along those lines. I did not tape this. For whatever reason, I wasn't sure if somebody else was going to tape it, but I decided not to tape this. Just as I didn't tape the business meeting either. So that he spoke for about an hour, and then after that they had a cake. Actually, they had two cakes, one a white cake and one a chocolate cake. And there was something drawn in icing on the cakes, and they suggested people could come up and take pictures of it before they cut the cakes. But everybody was rushing over there to take pictures, so I figured the pictures would surface, but so far I haven't seen any pictures yet. So I don't know what was on the cakes. I did get a piece of the chocolate cake. It was quite good. And after that, they had a presentation on Argosy, the Argosy magazine. Let's see, when that was called 120 Years of the Argosy, the world's first pulp magazine. And I stuck around for maybe the first 10, 20 minutes of that while I was eating the cake. But once again, unlike the business meeting and unlike the talk given by Ted White, they turned out all the lights in the room because there was slides to be projected or a PowerPoint presentation, which I didn't care for. After that, they were going to have, they had an auction, but once again, I didn't stick around for the auction. And the auction is basically, as I understand it, consisted of items that people had up for, I guess, books that they have up for auction. And I think the way it works is that the person who puts it up for auction gets the bulk of the money, but PulpFest picks up a cut of it, 10 or 15%. I'm not sure what it is, but old pulp novels and things like that. There was an opportunity to walk through and see the items that were going to be up for auction, but I passed on that in large part, I think, because I wasn't going to participate in the auction. So I left around sometime between 9 and 10. I think by 10 I was back at the apartment, and I got to bed earlier on Saturday night than I did on Sunday because I was getting up and leaving the next day. I wasn't going to show up at PulpFest for the last few hours of the show. I think it wraps up around 2 o'clock on Sunday, so it's not even a full day. It's only about 4 hours on Sunday. Sunday morning, I got up early and packed my stuff up, straightened up whatever mess I had made, which wasn't much. And I think I was in the car. I think I was leaving the apartment by about 7:50 or so, 7:45, 7:50. I decided to check out a bagel shop, which was honestly in the wrong direction. I probably should have just passed and had a bite to eat right near the apartment. But instead, I decided to go check out this bagel place called Barry's Bagels. And the bagels were good. They were good, but I just don't know if it was worth driving west when I needed to be heading east. So I left Barry's around 8:20, and I started to drive home. My original plan was to stop in Triadelphia again and gas up there, but I realized I probably didn't have enough gas to make it or I would be really cutting it close on making it to Triadelphia. So instead I stopped in Cambridge, Ohio, I don't know, maybe an hour and a half in, something like that. I put gas in the car. I also got a carrot cake roll and some water. And then I got back on the road. I think I was stopped for maybe a total of 20, 25 minutes, something like that. About 20 minutes, I think it was. I think it was a little after 11 when I got back on the road, something like that. And instead of stopping at Triadelphia, I drove all the way to Morgantown, West Virginia. And I stopped at a Sheetz there, just as I had stopped at a Sheetz in Cambridge. I didn't need to put gas in the car at that point, but I did get something to eat. I used the bathroom, and I got something to eat. I got a buffalo chicken wrap, I think it was. This is something that was pre-made. It wasn't, they have that made-to-order system at Sheetz, but I just picked up something that looked good. And I had some chips left over from Panera from Thursday, which I hadn't eaten then, so I busted those out. I had those with the wrap, and did I also have an apple? I think I had an apple also. There was no, I didn't eat that apple. I saved that apple until I got home. That's right. But so I had water, and I had the buffalo chicken wrap, and I had the chips, and that was enough to keep me going for the rest of the afternoon. So I left there after about, 25 minutes, something like that. And I drove all the way to Hagerstown, Maryland, which isn't too far from D.C. I stopped at another Sheetz there. The traffic got really slow within about, say, 20, 30 miles of Hagerstown. There was just a number of spots where everything just got very slow. This was Sunday afternoon, so maybe that's understandable. But I finally got to the Sheetz in Hagerstown. I bought some water. I wanted to get an ice cream bar, and I looked around. I circled around through the convenience store at the Sheetz a couple times, but they didn't have, one of those cases which has like ice cream bars in it. So I decided, I didn't want to get something else, so I just got the water because it was hot, and I was drinking a lot of water. And then I got back in the car and I kept going. I didn't need gas at that point. So I drove the rest of the way home, and I got home around 4:20, about 8 hours after I had left Barry's Bagels back in, I think Barry's Bagels is actually in Dublin, Ohio. I don't think it's in Columbus. So it took me about 8 hours to get home, including stops, probably about an hour of stop time, something like that. So probably about 7 hours of driving. I was definitely ready to get home. I found it a lot easier to drive home during the day, although I still was getting kind of tired and needing a break, which is part of the reason why I stopped in Hagerstown instead of just pushing all the way through at that point. After I put some of my stuff away, after I unloaded the car and I put all the beer that I'd brought home with me, which had stayed nice and cool in the cooler, in my refrigerator, I didn't clean up or anything. I just basically got in the car because it was a rental after all. I had to return it. So I got in the car and I drove back to National Airport where I had rented it from to Avis, I believe it was. I took a bike helmet with me and a little backpack and a book, and so I dropped off the car, which went very smoothly, no problems at all. I stopped on the way to put gas in the car, of course, because it had a full tank of gas when I left, and I didn't want to get charged some exorbitant rate for refilling the tank. I drove back through town instead of taking the beltway around town, and I dropped off the car, and then I walked to the metro, and I caught the metro most of the way home, and I bicycled the last 4 miles from the metro using a bike share bike, and it was pretty darn hot, but I hadn't gotten a lot of exercise in the last few days, and I do a lot of bicycling during the week as part of my commute, and I just felt like doing that, so I did that. And that was about it for PulpFest. Now it's a week after PulpFest, and I'm finally getting around to recording about the third and fourth days of my trip. On the whole, I'd say it was a positive experience. I think if I had gone just for PulpFest, I would be less satisfied with the trip. I mean, I enjoyed the apartment that I stayed in. I'm very glad that I made arrangements to buy beer. It gave me another reason to go. I'm glad that I went to Pack Rat Comics. As disorganized as their collections of their back issue bins were, or their $1 back issue bins were. I'm very glad that I went there and that I did more than just PulpFest. I mean, one of the things that I will say about PulpFest is I think that there's a kind of, I don't know, inner circle is the word or the term that immediately comes to mind. That's probably not the best way to describe it. But I think a lot of these people who come to this have been going for a number of years. I would say the average age is probably in their 50s to 60s, something like that, of the people who attend this. And maybe it's not even 50s. Maybe it is more like 60s. There were not a lot of people that I saw who were my age or younger. There were some, but there were not a lot. I would say most of them were, 40s, 50s, 60s, and possibly some people a little older than that. As I said about some of the presentations, I wasn't terribly impressed by them. I think it's a case of something where if you really love something, you will overlook some of the faults of it. And that's my opinion. I don't think the presentation skills of some of these people were great, but I enjoyed the three panels. The one on Friday, was it Friday? Yes, the one on Friday evening, and the first one on Friday evening, and then the two panels that I taped, the Amazing World of New Pulp and 10 Years in the Shadow Sanctum. I enjoyed both of those, all three of those panels. But the other panels, which weren't really panels, they were more like presentations, didn't do as much for me. The talk by the guest of honor, Ted White, was good, but once again, I felt a little bit out of the loop, a little bit like I had not read a lot of the things that he was talking about, and so it was interesting, but it just was not as interesting as if I was as familiar with pulp fiction, pulp stories, pulp novels as I am with comic books. So I don't know if I'll be going back next year, in part because of the timing with this, of when the show's going to be and this family reunion that I like to go to. But it's also because of the experience I had with some of these panels. Like I said, the cases where it was really a panel discussion I thought were good, but the cases where it was just one person presenting material I was not as impressed by, or I was not as taken by. It may be that some of this information is stuff that is very hard to come by, and so I don't appreciate as much because I'm not as interested in this stuff, what they had to share, but that's my opinion of what I experienced. On the whole, it was a good trip. I'm not sad I went. It did cost me, I had to rent a car, and while the room I stayed in was not expensive, the apartment I stayed in was not expensive, it still was a cost, and I paid about $60 for gas. And, the meals, I had some very good meals, and I don't think there's any meals that I really felt like were awful or anything. All of the food was good. I noticed that there was a lot of pizza places in Columbus, especially in the neighborhood where I was staying. And I'm not a big pizza guy, especially because I try to avoid dairy products for the most part. I don't avoid them completely, but I try not to eat too much of them. And pizza, of course, has cheese, which means there's a lot of dairy. So generally speaking, I do not eat pizza. But that's about it for PulpFest 2016. We'll see if I'm come back in 2017 or in a future year. Maybe I will. Columbus seemed like a nice town. I think part of that was due part to the fact that I was staying near Ohio State, but it was the summertime, and so I believe Ohio State is a pretty big school. I'm not sure what the average enrollment there is these days, but I'm guessing it's probably in the tens of thousands. And I'm sure that neighborhood would have been a lot busier. The neighborhood where I'm staying would have been a lot busier if school had been in session. But on the whole, a very positive experience, a very positive trip. But I'm just not sure if I'm going to go back next year or not. Two more things before I wrap up this episode. First, on the subject of the shadow, I went back and I found it took a bit of searching because I didn't remember exactly who was on the episode, but I found the episode of Pulp Crazy where they talked about the shadow, and there were some people talking about their favorite stories from the shadow, their favorite novels. And it wasn't actually, it's in the Pulp Crazy feed, but it's not actually an episode of Pulp Crazy. What it is it's a panel that Jason recorded from PulpFest 2011. The panel was called Walter B. Gibson and the Shadow. The audio quality isn't great. If you want to listen to it, if you're a diehard fan of The Shadow or you're really interested in The Shadow, I'd say give it a listen. Some people come in clearer than others. I guess the microphones weren't great, or the where Jason was recording from, he was able to pick up some people better than others. The panel consisted of Randy Cox, Ed Hulse, Will Murray, and Anthony Tolan, who's the guy that I bought the books from, the one Shadow book and the Doc Savage book. It runs about 40 minutes. The recording is about 40 minutes long, and it's about 30 minutes into that. For about 4 minutes, 5 minutes, the people on the panel discuss some of their favorite Shadow novels. And as I wrote down what I was able to hear, because some of them, like I said, it was a little hard to hear. The Salamanders, Grove of Doom, Lingo, Romanoff Jewels, or maybe it's The Romanoff Jewels, and the first three Shadow novels, which are The Living Shadow, Eyes of the Shadow, and The Shadow Laughs. And I think those are the first three novels, but if they're not the first three, at least as far as publication order goes, I believe those are the original ones that tell the origin of the Shadow, or they are the earliest stories of the Shadow. And the one I bought, of course, was Zemba, which was another one that they mentioned, along with the Man from Scotland Yard, which was not one that they mentioned. If you Google the Shadow, actually, if you Google Sanctum Books, two things. Number one, I found out that there's another company called Sanctum Books. So if you Google Sanctum Books, make sure you're looking for the one. It should have Anthony Tolan's name on it, and it is the one that, of course, deals in pulps, reprints of old pulp novels. There's a couple other websites that popped up when I searched for Sanctum Books. One was Pulp Coming Attractions, and there was actually a page devoted to Sanctum Books. And the neat thing about that is they show all of the covers to all the Sanctum Books. And then also there's the shadowssanctum.com, which is the official website of Anthony Tolan's company. And you see some of the covers there as well, although it's up to date, interestingly enough, as the Pulp Coming Attractions website is. I think they're missing like the last 6 months worth of books on the Shadow Sanctum website. And then finally there was another company called Vintage Books, which has all of the pulp novels from Shadow Sanctum, from Sanctum Books, and from some other companies. And the neat thing about that website, in addition to having pictures of all the covers, they also give you an idea. They do a very good job of organizing and telling you which novels are included in each book, and a short description, like a sentence or two on each story. And I just thought their website, Vintage Books, which is a bookseller, and I believe you can buy them all through there, as well as through the Shadow Sanctum website. All of the Vintage Book website I thought was excellently organized, and if you just want to browse, that might be a good way to browse, or if you want to buy from them, you could buy from them, and I think their prices were very reasonable. I looked on Amazon, and I saw people reselling these for quite a bit, at least in a couple instances, for quite a bit, so I was kind of surprised. The other thing that I wanted to talk about was Ron Fortier, the guy who is the general manager, I believe, of Airship 27, or the publisher of Airship 27, this publishing house. He actually has a blog called Airship 27, That's the web address. And that's his personal blog, as I understand it. He blogged in there a little bit about PulpFest and about other things. But there's a couple other websites connected to Airship 27. If you Google Airship 27, and certainly if you leave a space between Airship and 27, which is the way I did it, the first thing is Ron Fortier's blog. But the second thing is Airship 27 PDF. It's a website called robmdavis.com/airship27. And there you would see all of the books listed. It's not a great website, and I say that because of the way it's organized. I think it could be better organized, but it has a lot of information. It has all of the latest books there. I believe you can buy them through that website. I believe you can buy them on Amazon as well. I think just about everything I sell is available on Amazon, but maybe you get a little more information there. I don't know how many reviews there are on Amazon, but those are a couple websites worth checking out if you're interested in these new pulp books. And then finally, there's also a Airship 27 Productions, which is found at airship27.blogspot.com, which is kind of an announcement blog, I believe, for Airship 27, where they announce new books and maybe convention appearances, things along those lines. Now, one of the things that happened at that panel on the new pulp was there was a guy in the audience, the guy I was sitting behind, who is in that picture, the guy in the yellow shirt. He's a podcaster, and he has a podcast called Arts Reviews, which can be found at artsreviews.libsyn.com. I tried doing a search for it using Downcast, and I couldn't find it. I was kind of surprised. But I did find it. I eventually found it on the Libsyn website because he had mentioned that it was a Libsyn site, or that's who hosts his podcast. And he covers a lot of pulp topics. And one of the subjects that came up during the panel was the new adventures of Sinbad. So I went looking, and they had mentioned in the panel that Ron and Art had done a podcast about Sinbad with a couple of the writers, and I believe they've even done audiobooks of some of these new adventures of Sinbad, and there were 5 of them that have come out to date. And I believe they had some of the voice cast from the audiobooks on there. So I went looking for that. Now I found it. I haven't listened to it. But the reason why I haven't listened to it was because I got distracted when I found it. When I found it, there was a link there to another podcast, a podcast called Better in the Dark, specifically to episode 8 of Better in the Dark, which came out several years ago, back in 2007. But what interested me about that was that on that episode, they talked about the Sinbad trilogy by Ray Harryhausen. It's not a very long episode. It's only about 50 minutes, but it's 2 guys from Brooklyn talking about the Sinbad movies by Ray Harryhausen. The first one came out in the late 50s, and the other 2 came out in the mid to late 70s. Now, I don't think I've ever seen the first one, but I have seen the second and third ones. And I believe I saw them in the theater, in fact, back in the 70s. I believe I remember my father taking me and possibly my brother, one of my brothers, to go see them. And those are Sinbad, the Golden Voyage of Sinbad, and Sinbad in the Eye of the Tiger. I'm not sure if either of them are great movies, but I remember enjoying them at the time. And so I listened to the podcast. If you have any interest, maybe if you've seen these movies before, you'd be interested in listening to this. But I thought it was a fun listen. They talk about the movies in a certain amount of detail. It's only about 15 minutes per movie at tops. But it was interesting to hear how they approached the movies and how they described the movies and what they chose to emphasize. And it brought back memories of things that I'd seen. And it also makes me want to go and see the movies again. I'm not sure how I would see them on DVD or maybe on streaming somehow. But I remember going back to rewatch The Golden Voyage of Sinbad, and it's been at least 20 years since I watched either of those films, but I remember going back to rewatch The Golden Voyage of Sinbad, probably in the 80s sometime, And what struck me then, what I didn't remember, because of course I didn't know who this person was, but the bad guy in The Golden Voyage of Sinbad, which is the second film, which I believe came out in '74, was played by Tom Baker, who of course later went on to play Doctor Who. And as they talk about in this episode, it was his role in The Golden Voyage of Sinbad that got him the attention of the producers of Doctor Who. So that was a neat story. Definitely worth a listen if you have any interest in Ray Harryhausen or the Sinbad movies. That's it for episode 119, but my coverage of PulpFest continues in the near future with the recordings I made of the New Pulp and Sanctum Books panels. If you are interested in more coverage of PulpFest, past and present, I also recommend you check out Pulp Crazy, which can be found on iTunes, YouTube, and other locations where podcasts are usually found. Dave Talks Comics can be found at davetalkscomics.com, as well as on iTunes, Stitcher, and a few other locations. If you have comments or questions, I can be reached at davetalkscomics@gmail.com, on Twitter @DaveTalksComics, or leave a comment on my website. I'm Dave. Thank you for listening.